Hi, welcome to ODI and our Friday lunchtime lecture. Thank you so much for coming or tuning in. So at the ODI, we have a vision, which is for a world where data works for everyone, and public services are an incredibly important part of that vision. Today we have two fantastic speakers who'll be talking about how to use human stories and data to create better and simpler services in our communities. We have Maia Tarling-Hunter and Vimla Appadoo. Maia is Senior Design Researcher and Vimla is a Service Designer at FutureGov. So we are really excited about what they're going to be telling us. If I could ask the audience in the room here just to save their questions for the end of the lecture. We'll be passing around this microphone so that the people tuning in on the stream can hear. And if you are watching on the stream, hello, welcome. If you'd like to ask a question, then please use our Twitter handle, ODI Fridays. So really excited to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Hi everyone, happy International Women's Day. Just to give you a heads up, there's going to be a little bit of audience participation starting now. So to kick things off and before we introduce ourselves or get into the talk, we want you to choose whether you're team tea or team coffee. So do you prefer tea or coffee? And we want tea to be over on that side of the room and coffee to be on this side of the room. Ready? Go.
Off you go. You're sitting on the floor on this one.
You did that to get me on my...
Sorry. You can, yeah. Thank you. It is divisive, and that's one of the points we'll be picking up later. So this is a reference that you'll see later on in the presentation, so bear it in mind when it rears its head again. But just for now, know who your enemies are.
So we are FutureGov, and FutureGov is an agency that works to reform health and public services through digital transformation and service design. We've got some photos up here of our lovely team, and because it is International Women's Day, let's introduce some of the designers in our team. And we're asking you to, well, we're introducing people like as designers, but we're thinking quite differently, potentially, about what we mean by design. So some of the people we have in our team, for example, are Sahel, who has a background, she did the programme Year Here and a background in geography. We've got Ale at the bottom here, who has a background in furniture design. One of our colleagues, Kat, used to work in national government. So we're a real mix of people who call ourselves designers. And
what kind of runs through the heart and soul of FutureGov is taking 21st century challenges, to challenge this. We want to change the way that government and large-scale organisations think about their services so that we bring the services that we use every day up to the expectations that we now have, using technology and data as a way of doing that, but also making sure that those services meet the needs of the people that need to use them.
So to introduce a little bit about ourselves, and again to say that I don't come from a traditional design background. So I came to design over a slightly winding route. Originally, well, I was thinking about this when me and Vim were talking about what started you off being a designer. And I remember when I was a kid having this real strong sense that we needed to be able to see the world through other people's eyes. And being really angry as a child that people couldn't see that, and therefore these awful things were happening around the world, that because people weren't able to empathise with or see that these were families that were being harmed regardless of where they lived or politics. I then worked as a teacher in East London, teaching English in a secondary school, and one of the things I really loved about that and my job there was how the children interacted with with other people through the medium of literature, of poetry. So we did lots of activities, often around writing final chapter from the perspective of another character in the book, or and also in terms of using, I suppose, objects and pictures to provoke collaboration and ways of thinking together, which I think is very central to the design process. So, for example, often start off a new book rather than, here's a book, we're going to get started on a book, which universally would require groans all the way around the room. Actually, let's bring in some prompts. So borrow a skeleton, for example, from the science team, borrow some other sort of things that help people that were linked to the book, and start that inquiry around those objects. That allow people to engage in a very different way with things. And then over from there, I did a Master's Reform for the Future, which really was about going out and looking at different systems through the lenses of different organisations and different places. So we'd look at the food system by going on placement. Someone would go on placement at Sainsbury's, someone will have gone to a local ethical supermarket in Brighton. I went to the Green Party, looked at food policy, and we come back together and through those different lenses look at some of those challenges for the food systems and ways to solve them. And then finally, now I'm at FutureGov, previously worked at the charity Sustrans, very much working with residents, working with staff to try to solve tricky social problems through co-design and bringing people together to address those problems and test them out together.
And I'm Vim. My background's in history and politics, so I studied history and politics at university, and I think similar to Maia, I grew up knowing that I wanted to do something that would have an impact on people and the way the world works around us. And funnily enough, I think my mum told me the story the other day, actually, where she kind of went, well, Vim, you know you started your own business when you were about 7. I was like, what? I don't remember that. And I turned my bedroom into a shop. And I would charge my mum to come into my bedroom. But I'd written a business plan for it. So I was like, well, if I can charge her 50p every day, by the end of like 3 weeks, I'll be able to afford the next Barbie that I want, or whatever it was. So I think from a very young age, I was thinking about things in a really different way and problem solving, I mean, respectively, very selfish problems that I had at the time, but trying to think of different ways to reach an aim or a goal. Not at all related to history and politics, but it kind of shows that I took the skills I had from history and politics and took them into the startup world. And my early career, I really was focused on tech startups in Manchester, which is where I'm based. So I ran a Tech for Good accelerator up north, which supported for-profit and purpose businesses who were trying to do good through technology. Throughout that, I was using service design practices to help them establish what their business was and how they were problem solving and how to make sure the services or products that they were building really solved a need in the world. I then moved to a project focusing on smart cities initiatives and how to build IoT infrastructure across Manchester to really support community needs, so working as a community manager and service designer to bring those two things together. And that led me into service design and government, where I was at the Department for Work and Pensions, using service design to redesign the perception of debt, fraud and error, and how you can really change the mindset not just of citizens but of government as to what that means and how to deal with it, and having a longer term view of what debt is, through to FutureGov, where we now work across the UK looking at services from knife crime in Tower Hamlets to welfare in Sheffield, and where in Bradford I became a bin crew for a week. So yeah, huge variety of things that we're doing.
So in terms of, to get us a feel for who's in the room, hands up how many people here would call themselves a designer? It's really interesting. Well, we're hoping to convince you that most people have elements of design in the way that they're working or living in the world. So there are lots of assumptions, I suppose, about what design is and how to describe it. So pieces of art, is a piece of art a piece of is design? When we're going to be talking to you about design today, we're not talking about a piece of art. We're not talking about a beautifully designed chair or even a beautifully designed website, but we're thinking of it as a way to solve problems, often tricky social problems, often quite divisive problems, a bit like, for example, the tea or coffee, probably less tricky as social.
So the way we see design at FutureGov is a little bit like this. We use the Design Council's Double Diamond methodology to deconstruct problems and to problem solve. So we go through a process of divergent and convergent thinking to really dig deep into the underlying problems that we're trying to solve. We go through a 4-stage process generally, which is discover, define, develop and deliver. But at each point, we go back and iterate. So at each point of this process, we're continually going back on ourselves to sense check what we're doing, to validate with data, to validate with user stories, and to bring lots of different key stakeholders into the room to make sure we're solving the right problem. The first half of this process is really understanding the problem, and the second half of the process is designing the right thing. So we really try and make sure that at every point we're sense checking what we're doing with the people that are going to be accessing the service at some point on the journey. And I think what's really important to this process is we look at the end-to-end, back-to-front journey. So we're not just thinking about the website, the app, the piece of software that we might be developing. We're thinking about how you find out about this new service, who you might come into contact with offline, who you first go to through help, those conversations that you have in the pub or in the street or on a bus that help inform the decisions that you make, through to not needing that service anymore or reaching your goal or obtaining your outcome. So back to that tea or coffee question. So you might have been sitting there thinking, well, actually, I don't like tea or coffee. And what this is a really good example of is a problem or a provocation where not all of the alternatives have been considered. And often what you see in a question like this is you've actually got the solution in there. So we're assuming there are only 2 options here, tea or coffee, and that's it. We're not giving you any other choices. And what we see when we work with large-scale organisations is that this is often what we're faced with. So you can either do an app or a website, or you can use this data set, or you can go out and speak to people. And we work in a world of dichotomies that someone said it as we asked this question at the beginning, if this is really divisive. And that's the point. We often try and see our problems in a really simplified way that often divides the people that we're trying to work with. What we do as designers is try and break this down into a language that everyone can understand. So rather than having the words tea and coffee, which might present accessible issues or might not be the way that everyone interprets those, we try and break it down to something that's a little bit more visual to build a consensus in the room of what we're trying to get across. So it might be that we use images that everyone stands around and talks to, rather than a question that's handed to someone and you take away and evaluate on your own. We try and bring people around an object, around an artifact to deconstruct. And then we rewrite the question. So through research and through working with people in a room, through standing around the artifact and redesigning the process, we will change the problem to something that we can answer. So rather than asking whether people like tea or coffee, we would dig really deep and ask, like, well, why do you drink tea or coffee? What is it that you're trying to get out of those drinks? What other alternatives are there? What is it that you're really trying to do with that? And you might end up with something like, well, how can I have energy throughout the day? You might also have, how can I stay hydrated? Or how do I stop myself falling asleep? But you also then open up a whole bunch of different alternatives to that. You open up a huge ideation space. So having energy throughout the day might mean getting a better night's sleep the night before. It might mean having less stress throughout your working day. It might mean sharing your workload with colleagues. So there's a huge different variation of this that are not just who prefers tea or coffee. Do you want to?
Yeah, so I can introduce. So Vim and I have been working together in Bradford, and we've been supporting Bradford Council as their digital transformation partner to look at some of those big tricky challenges that they're trying to face. So Bradford's a really interesting area. It's an area with very high levels of inequality, some very deprived areas, some very multicultural district, and also an interesting mix of having a kind of a big urban area, big city in the centre of it, but then much of Bradford and much of Bradford residents also live in those rural areas on the outskirts. So some of the challenges we were working with the council to look at were specifically around their waste services and welfare advice services. Do you want to give a bit of background as to how we got there?
So we used the double diamond process back in June last year to work across the whole of the Bradford Council. So we looked at every service that the council offers to its citizens, and we ran a series of workshops with key stakeholders in the council, alongside getting citizen feedback to build a narrative of what problems the council face, but also matching those alongside the perception of the council in the community and how people think and felt living in Bradford district. And what that gave us was a breadth of opportunity areas to work in, one of which was waste and one of which was welfare, that both ticked the boxes of the council to be more efficient, to reach cost savings and to provide a better service to its people, but also were important to citizens, ticked both the big P and little p boxes of politics, but also could have a really positive impact on lifestyle and well-being in the district as well.
Brilliant. So for the, have been working predominantly, still am, on the project looking at welfare advice. So we were given we worked with the council to identify this as an area, welfare advice, great. Got there with one of my other colleagues, Sarah, and thought, actually, welfare advice, what does that mean? Does that mean anything to people? So a big part of all of our work, and very much when we're at that early stage of understanding the problem better, the first thing we do is go and engage with users. In this case, users being residents, but also crucially staff who are delivering these services. So we sat in on calls that staff were taking, we shadowed them and had interviews to understand what they saw as some of the challenges to welfare advice services. And actually what became apparent is that welfare advice services, which are commissioned to provide advice for complex immigration, debt, legal advice, so often people who are incredibly vulnerable in crisis or at risk of falling into crisis. These welfare advice services didn't sort of sit neatly apart from other advice that people were seeking from the council, and we also and that very much that staff experience correlated with the conversations that we were having with residents. So meeting residents at different advice services, but also connecting with them through other community provision to understand what they needed from and wanted from these services. And it was what came out of our interrogation of this was how people were having such a different experience of services all across the council, and how there was the missing shared view of advice services, which meant that someone who was in a situation, quite a desperate situation, may have been made homeless, not enough food, no food for the table, their child has been kicked out of school, were in a situation where they were they are in a situation where they're trying to navigate lots of different services in lots of different locations all around Bradford, and often therefore falling further into crisis. So if you're not getting your benefits because you've moved out of your house and you're not able to you become not able to access lots of different services, which means that debt, for example, is something that spirals.
And kind of almost at the completely opposite end of the spectrum, the project I've been working on is in waste services, where we were having very different conversations with the users and residents in Bradford about the way that their bins are collected, how they report things online, how important that is to them and their life in Bradford as well. And people care a lot about their bins, and it was really interesting to go out and bring users into the conversation about the things that they knew and things that they didn't know about those waste services, and building the narrative, communication plans and insights around what the users were saying to us. So we got them in really early with lo-fi prototypes to understand their interaction with what we were saying and how we could build the service.
Brilliant. So data is really important to us. We human stories, yes, are absolutely kind of central to how we understand a problem, but so is data. But we describe data as driving but not leading, because in many ways you can only measure what you're collecting, right? And what you're not collecting is often that it, well, in particularly for Bradford Advice Services, was where some of the really big problems and challenges were. So if we have what we have at the moment in Bradford is lots of different ways of collecting individuals' data at different organisations, but no way of cross-checking that data. So you can't. It's not easy to recognise those people who are accessing lots of different types of services, right? So you're not able to easily notice those people who are at risk of falling into crisis. What was also interesting around the data that's being collected, specifically by local community organisations that are providing some of the welfare advice support, so the council is paying them, commissioning them to provide the support, is that the feedback that they need to provide for the council at the moment is a kind of grouping of that person's needs, which are often complex and multiple, into one area. So this person's come in around benefits, or this person has come in around immigration. We know from speaking to people that it's not as simple as that. People are, in terms of that data, the other piece of data that's being fed back into the council is the number of people who are presenting through the door. Now, if you're counting your services and measuring your services based on the number of people coming through the door rather than the number of people, for example, whose problems are being solved by accessing your services, then essentially you're creating a system where you're driving demand within the system to get numbers through the door rather than actually genuinely help people. So that's kind of one of the sort of interaction that we often use. We very much use and scrutinise the data from the beginning and throughout to understand what that's telling us, but then we back that up with human stories to understand that problem further and deeper.
And I think in a similar vein to bringing the user in the room, it's once you get that story and the numbers associated to it that you build a real sense of empathy with the people delivering the services. So yes, I can see that we've had 50 people through the door, but what you don't then see is the heartbreaking stories that each one of those people has had to listen to or go through or recount every time they come through that door. So we really try and use the data and the stories to build the whole image of what this is looking like, and you can't do one without the other. The stories on their own don't mean anything because it could just be one person, but the numbers lack that depth and insight to be able to tell the decision maker how hard it really is or what really needs to be improved. So we definitely try and use both of those things. But we also really like to say that the design is leading this because it's this design-led approach that helps us uncover what data it is we need and how to use it, and more importantly, how to analyse that to make decisions. So in Bradford, we were using data in a way that the council had never done before. So Waste Services had a set of vulnerable people data through citizens who had said they need help with their bins. So these are people that don't have the agility to take their bins out themselves, so the bin men do it on their rounds. And then another part of the council had another vulnerable people's list for essentially the same group of people. Neither of those lists had been updated for about 10 years, and they had never cross-referenced those lists to see if they were the same people who might be missing. And the emergency planning team then asked the Waste Services team for their list, but the Waste Services team didn't trust the data enough to give it to them. And it was at a point of flooding in Bradford, which meant they had a huge amount of people at risk, but they didn't know. So a really simple project to just cross-reference that data, do a data cleanse and visualise it really quickly, help them show how you can do that kind of data sharing in a really iterative way to then help make decisions, which is where the design bit came in. It's kind of, if this is half of the story, if this is half of the data and this is the story, what do we need to do? How do we need to use it and what impact can it have?
And I think that brings us quite nicely onto uniting around a thing. So it's all very well as designers hearing all these different stories, finding out these different kind of multiple complex issues. But a key part of for the design process for us is around bringing that information together and sharing it in a way that people can easily understand and scrutinise and look at together. So this is, for example, a map of some, and I stress it is still some, of the advice services across Bradford. And this is why when we started the project, we had a minor heart attack. It's huge, very, very complex, and this is the same for any borough or local authority. So, but what this allowed people to do was that when we brought this to the table, we suddenly had people who worked in different sections of advice, seeing themselves as part of a bigger system. And I remember one lady saying, I never really see myself. I work in my neighbourhood, run my centre, but I don't really see myself as part of this system. And that's really not being able to see that is really problematic. It means that you can't support residents to navigate that system. It means that work is being duplicated across the system. So different providers are providing the same advice, which is expensive, but it's also a waste of time for residents when they're kind of being shunted around. And so being able to present something visual, sometimes it might be something that we can touch and feel. So Vim touched on prototyping, so testing out an idea early on and presenting it and reading it through that helps people develop a much more shared view of what's going on, and also means that we can work together to develop solutions that work for everyone rather than just work from one perspective.
And I think the kind of emphasis on a thing is really important here, because it doesn't just have to be a well-designed map, and it doesn't have to be a website or something tangible. It can even be as simple as just getting everyone into a room to have a conversation about a problem that they're facing. And I think often it's those conversations that are the most fruitful to progressing the project or the solution, rather than the artefact that you're discussing.
And so that kind of brings us to our approach that is ultimately about delivering better services for people. So in Bradford, over the next few months, we've had a co-design session with different providers and workers in the council as well, and looked at ideas to address some of these challenges for the advice services. And rather than the council's obviously under a huge amount of pressure at the moment across the country in terms of money. Rather than sort of cutting existing services, we've been able to, as a result of this approach, fundamentally rethink what we want our services to look like in Bradford. So we're looking at testing out a co-location of services, but co-location, so having different services in one space, but not just having it in one space, actually thinking about what does that mean in terms of how we work together as different organisations. Do we, to residents, refer to each other as colleagues? Do we help them do we do the connecting rather than signposting residents somewhere else to somewhere else and getting them to have to do the connecting themselves, which can be really challenging when in quite a desperate situation. And we've also been looking at what it means to at that beginning stage of someone presenting and needing advice, what we call often triage, where you're being decided what services you can access. Instead of thinking about having high numbers of people through the door and therefore triaging people quickly, actually should we be spending a longer period of time, up to an hour, say, with someone to understand their needs, and not just the one need that they initially come with, but giving space to understand what their needs are as a whole person, and investing that time up front to then be able to help them much quickly access the services that they need and stop them falling further into crisis, which ultimately to a council will cost you much more time and money, and from a human perspective can have a devastating impact on people's lives.
And in the Waste Services project, it's come about, we've had 3 prototypes that we've launched with the service. The first one has been new service models for people. So this is creating almost on-demand waste collection for Bradford citizens, so in a way that meets expectations of what a 21st century service looks and feels like, but based on your needs as a citizen. And we were testing this within garden waste. So as Maia said earlier, a lot of Bradford is really rural with large gardens. So if you're gardening more in the summer, you might need more collections over the summer months than in the winter. So we're testing how different service models might work for different citizens, which is quite groundbreaking in the waste space. The second prototype is opening council data and information out to citizens in a way that hasn't been done before. So essentially giving citizens as much information about their service as we have. So we know if a citizen hasn't put their bin out, or we know bad weather's coming, so the round or the time that we're going to collect your bin is going to be delayed. We're testing what opening out that data to citizens when they need it, what the impact is on their behaviour. Does it decrease the amount of complaints we get? Does it mean people are less likely to report that their bin's been missed? All of that kind of stuff that, again, has never been done before. And the third one was the data prototype I mentioned earlier. So testing and validating that cross-referencing between different council data sets and understanding how you can use it to make better informed decisions, particularly around vulnerable people in the district. All coming from waste services as well, which is really incredible. And that's it. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's incredibly interesting. So now it's time for questions. I am just going to kick us off, if that's okay, because I'm interested in understanding a bit more about where you get the data from in order to inform this process. So, of course, it's fascinating the balance between qualitative and quantitative data that you're pulling on and informing those questions and making sure that you're asking the right questions and identifying what the actual problem is. At the ODI, we've been doing a lot of work in this field as well and looking at how data in itself can be a service and the balance between data sharing internally within a local council and between different local councils and existing data externally. So my question is, are you often making new data? Are you discovering what the problem is and trying to and having to go out and explore that and do surveys yourself? Or are you often finding that there's existing data within a council that you can use in a new way in order to inform the question that you've discovered?
A little bit of both. So there'll be the council does hold heaps of data and information that's really useful, but often what we find is they're not analysing it or utilising it in the right way. So they'll have all of this data but not look at it. And so our job is really to understand what that data is saying and how we can break it down into a way that makes sense to find where the gaps are and where those, what it's actually telling us about the people that live there, and then how you might use it in the future. And then the services that we're building will implement the right, or what we think is the necessary data capture at those points to help keep making those decisions.
And I think there's something about accessing data. So something that, so for example, in welfare advice, there were certain parts of advice services that we were hearing over and over again from people, where people, for example, were going backwards and forwards between different services, or something was slightly broken and wasn't quite working. And what we're able to do is then to return to the data and see whether that data is sort of backing up that what's being said there, so that rather than sometimes when you collect data, if you're not, how do you access it? How do you make sense of it almost? And it comes down to often in kind of, a strapped team, they're just looking at it from their perspective. Oh, yep, have we got the numbers, or is it telling us what we think? But actually what we're able to do is help navigate and cross-reference, I suppose, between different data sets as a result of our of the qualitative research that we're doing.
And use them to verify your
Exactly.
ideas.
Exactly.
Great, that's really interesting. So, does anybody else have any questions in the room? Okay, we've got one at the back, one at the front. I'm going to take you guys in order, if that's okay.
I just wanted, in terms of the user research that you do and the feedback from users, how much do you involve the people who run the systems, the current systems? I'm just thinking from my own experience, you've got sort of people who can be very receptive to something being changed for the better, and some people can be very sort of protective of the current way that they work. And I just wondered, do you involve them quite heavily in the sort of user research and engagement process?
I can definitely answer that for welfare advice, because it's been a really challenging area, because this project has been around digital transformation for the council, but alongside this there are cuts that are coming in for the welfare advice sector, and these are separate. There was a consultation happening, but separately but at the same time, in the sense that, like the same date and time. So there's inevitable crossover going on here. Now, I think that very much from our perspective, we knew, so we work in quite an open way in FutureGov. We try to. Openness and transparency should be at the heart of what we do, and we hold fortnightly show and tells where we share back what we've found out, what we've been doing, and invite people to sense check what we're doing, and also to interrogate it, and often to help us build our understanding as well by being there. And so we hold this totally open to literally anyone can come along to them, but we've particularly targeted it at, yes, the council, but also existing welfare providers, other people who are experts and advice experts across Bradford. And part of that is about making sure that those is building on that rich experience and knowledge that those individuals and organisations have, but also it's because our approach is about involving people in design, in those experts in designing the better services as well. We see and recognise for welfare advice, these are the experts in the area. We aren't the experts. We are facilitating an understanding of the system and services, and we are facilitating a process that brings us to thinking differently about what those services could be. But it's not about us doing some user research, disappearing off, and this is what we find back. So some of the activities we've been doing, for example, as with that welfare advice map, actually, what are we missing here? What haven't we found out about to build on? And then I talked about the ideas sessions that we've had. So because we've had about 2 months worth of fortnightly show and tells, there is a good shared understanding of the problems, and when we brought people together to develop ideas, it was based in that shared understanding of what the challenges were, but also is about then involving current providers in developing those solutions. So we're going to be working with citizen advice, lots of local community centres that currently provide welfare advice to test out some of the new ideas to see whether they'd work in the context of Bradford.
It was, sorry.
I was going to say, when we think about the end-to-end and back-to-front, we're thinking of everyone that touches that service as a user. So it's the people that build the systems, manage the systems, use the systems, through to the bin, like in the waste team. We did research with the bin crews out on sites, how they use the software, how they use the in-cab technology, through to the people that we're doing the GIS mapping, through to the people making decisions about policy. So it's internal research with the users there, but then the end users as citizens too, and we match those two stories together. And we're trying to find the problems that are both a problem for the citizen and for the council as the areas that we want to focus on.
Because your example there was really good about, like, why would you measure something in terms of the number of people who come through the door to get their problem solved? And conversely, you'd think it'd be great if nobody came through the door, because then there's no problems to solve. It was just your tea coffee example that you're phrasing the question.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, my question is a little bit critical. I mean, you are doing this type of service, so why government cannot do it? Are you entitled to do this one in a way of provide innovative service to the citizen? This is the role of government. First question. Second, you talk about strategy like partner for you. How you do this strategy? Is it just the government with data? They should be able to do it. So this is the question is why you are involved, you and not government, to do this type of activities. Is not this wrong?
So we're working with government to do this. So
why they don't do it? What are they doing?
They do it to a certain extent. So often what we do is we'll work with councils and government because the cuts have meant that they're stretched and at their max capacity. So often need someone to come in and challenge the way that they're doing things and show them a different way of problem solving. It's that kind of trying to build a plane and fly it at the same time. It's the atmosphere in government at the moment is one of struggle and trying to get through a lot of different changes quickly, and we can come in and help them reach those aims and goals in a different way.
I think as well it's important to say that we work in combined teams with the council that we're working with. So we see ourselves, I mean, we talk about the fact that, you know, ideally in 10 years' time, we won't have to exist, right? Because people will have the skills to be able to be rethinking their services throughout, whilst also delivering really, really great services for residents. So we work in quite the team, for example, in welfare advice is there's 3 of us from FutureGov working with a team of about 20 or so from their sides, and building the people's skills and capabilities and using some of the approaches that we have is very much at the heart of our kind of our beliefs.
Yeah, and it's really hard to do. So it's not just for FutureGov, but for councils and large government organisations as well. So GDS are doing an amazing job in central government, but there's only so much they can do. So we're just another helping hand to do this in other parts of the country.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? We've got 2 over here and 1 over here. I'm sorry, I'm going to go with the T's first, sir, and then we'll come back.
I was just wondering, with the sort of work you're describing with Bradford, what kind of timescales you work to and what sort of outputs you're intended to deliver by the end of your work?
Yeah. So Bradford in particular, we started with the discovery in June last year, and we kicked off the waste project in October and have just finished it. So I think we were running in 2-week sprints, and we finished it on Tuesday this week, and we launched the 4 prototypes. 1 was to improve the existing service, and then the 3 that I went through. And we're using the rest of our time with the waste team to upskill them to carry on with those prototypes.
And similarly, so welfare advice, 4.5. Well, no, we're going to have had 9 sprints altogether that we've worked on. There, because of the fact that the council is under intense pressure for that particular service to deliver some kind of change and to rethink them. We're going to be testing and prototyping over the next few months, but also we're building a business case around the change. So yes, helping them to visualise and imagine what that could look and feel like, but also what is the reality if they were to put in these in places in terms of what impact it will have on individuals and on costs.
It's also worth mentioning actually, when we talk about it being months long, we're only on site 2 days a week, so it's quite short, intensive bursts of work where we're really pushing and decision making quickly.
When working with different communities across the UK, in terms of your relationship between yourselves and the user, how do you build this sense of trust, especially when carrying out sort of qualitative data methods? Yeah, what kind of methods do you use to try and build upon that trust and that commonality?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd say one of our key is going with through people who are already known and trusted. So, for example, for welfare advice, we know that there are local community centres and different organisations that people know well, and so we will work with them to help us find people who would be interested, who are unable to talk to us, or going to existing groups and events that they hold there already. So it's very much a process of going to, rather than expecting people to come from us. We also try to work often with peer researchers, so may train up or work with people in those locations to ask questions or share prototypes, for example, with and do that, have hold that relationship themselves. With the welfare advice team as well, we've been working with some of the council officers to upskill them in doing this kind of research themselves. And again, it totally makes sense that we don't hold these relationships because our ambition is that we won't be there for very long. And so that is very much, so if we can work to develop people's skills so that they're actually starting to use that as a method themselves ongoing, then that's what we try to do.
And I think very much to that point is going to where people are already. So going to meetups that are already happening, but preferably being invited to or giving a heads up to people that they know you're coming. But really taking the time to listen and have a conversation. So not being too demanding if the conversation goes off topic, but being comfortable and confident in the way you bring it back round, I think is really important.
Thank you. And we've got a question over here, but just as a small reminder, if anybody at home watching on the screen would like to ask a question, then we have our hashtag ODI Fridays.
I'm very interested in the way that public services have developed. My father, when he died, was one of the last surviving people who had actually administered the Poor Law. Say what you don't like about the Poor Law, it had a brilliant concept of holistic responsibility. The country was covered by a system of relieving officers, so-called because they handed out parish relief, who had an obligation to deal with any need in their area, which went literally from the cradle to the grave. If a couple were in denial about their daughter being pregnant, he had to admit the daughter to the maternity hospital. If a tramp died, he had to deal with a National Assistance Act burial. After it has to be said, he had gone through the tramp's pockets to ensure that he wasn't carrying a few pounds to avoid a pauper's burial. Now, what we've got now is a horrendous situation where you have divided responsibility. You don't have to do things, you have to find somebody else to pass them on to. And passing it on is seen as an end in itself. Do you think that data can help in getting us back to an idea of not just coordinated but total responsibility?
Great question.
Yeah, so I think we did a welfare mapping project in Sheffield, which told us exactly that. It's handoffs, not handovers. So citizens were having to constantly retell their stories to everyone that they met to try and get the help they needed. And as Maia said earlier, they weren't being seen as a whole person. It was kind of, we can fix your problem over here, but you need to go over there to fix this other problem, then you need to go over there to fix this other problem. All the meanwhile, you're just struggling, you're just trying to survive. And I think data can help us overcome a lot of those problems if we can find a way of sharing it and using it to protect people. And I think that's where the risk is in how we can do it in a safe way without abusing that data as well.
And I totally agree with that. I think that data gives feedback, right, on something, and it can be used to give very immediate feedback, if you want to, on how well a service is working. Now, it doesn't need to be about, as we talked about, sort of numbers, but actually, could it be more around understanding? So, for example, it's a really interesting model that they're trying out in the adults social services team at Bradford Council, whereby they have all the advisors have a very brief few questions that they're currently asking themselves as a result of each call that they do. This is all the telephone advisors. And then every 3 times a week, they have what's called a huddle. So they all stand up together as advisors, and they share back what they've been what people have been calling about through the phones. And that's used to help develop a shared strategy as to how to support people if there's common themes that are coming through, interesting ways that people are being supported, but also to flag if there's and quite often it's, for example, a particular policy that is around providing better kind of advice that's more easily available to people to be able to access. So it's kind of it's acting quickly on what people are telling you about. So yeah, I think there is a huge kind of space, and I think what's been really positive for me. So I'm also working in Doncaster, the assets around them, as it were, but also giving space to understand their multiple needs and address those in kind of one place.
You see this mainly as a problem of organisation or a problem of attitude?
So for anyone that didn't hear listening, if it was a problem of organisation or attitude, and I think it's a mixture of both. I think the organisations lend itself to having a certain attitude to how public services are delivered and how to support people, and I think it's a bit of a cycle. So those attitudes then perpetuate the organisations that then perpetuate the attitudes, which is often where you need someone to step in and say, actually, let's rethink the problem space, let's rethink how we're dealing with this and what support this person actually needs.
Great. I think just to put the ODI, or from the ODI's 10 pence in on that, there is an element as well about data being used to make better decisions in general, but there's also about access to data, which is something that you guys were talking about earlier. So the ability for a wider group of people to have visibility on that information and on that data enables the interventions in organisational attitude and ability. So there is something as well about openness and transparency informing those questions, if that's helpful. Are there any more questions in the room? We've got one more. I think this is we've got two more. I think if we can make them relatively short, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Got a couple more minutes, and then after that, I think we'll call it time.
Hi, very interesting. I think one of the challenges of sort of holistic design, service design, is measuring the success and also making sure that the concepts that you create actually are implemented. What are your thoughts around this, and how do you ensure that the things you come up with actually get into action?
Yeah, a huge problem for the sector. So for waste in particular, we've measured the whole way through. So the team are comfortable with knowing what we're measuring and how, and we set 6 weeks, 6 months, 12-month measurement goals for the impacts that we want these services to have. And in terms of implementation, we're working really closely with the team now to put their kind of sprint planning into action to make sure that it outlives our time on the project as well. And that's really where the upskilling of the teams is crucial, so that the people on the ground have those skills to keep it going and prioritise and keep making changes.
Yeah, I would echo that. I don't think I've necessarily got anything to add. I think that's exactly that bit working with people across that system as you develop ideas and understand the challenges, so that they're all involved and there's a kind of collective ownership as much as there can be over the ideas for change.
Thanks. I was also going to ask about evaluation, but was there any data that you could not find when you initially went in that you had to collect to start with?
Yes and no, in that the first answer was always we don't have the data, but then when we dug deeper they just didn't know it was the data we were looking for, because it wasn't to that specificity. So it was often a misunderstanding of the data that they actually held and what it meant for the service. So which is really where that kind of interpretation of data becomes important, and the analysis and how to use it, because they had reams and reams of spreadsheets that were saying loads of things, but they didn't know it was saying those things.
I think for advice, because there were multiple organisations and teams across the council delivering different types of advice, the data that wasn't there was understanding how people were moving between. So we've been doing a diary study for the last week and a half, where we've been getting advisors to make a note of where people are coming in from, so why people are contacting in the first place, if it's from somewhere else, and also where people are being passed on to, so that we can see where those the kind of the failure demand, as the term used, is being created, where backwards and forwards people are being referred. So that was something that, because of having different systems for all the different teams, it meant that all you could do is go in on an individual and say go with a name, and you could have a look at the different data sets for them. But I mean, when you're working with thousands of people across Bradford, that's just not a way of understanding where the real challenge was.
Great, thank you so much. Just from all of us to you, we are very grateful. That was fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks.